Hello and welcome to today's episode of the On the Up podcast brought to you from Moneypenny. I'm your host Dan Marshall and today I'm joined by Charlotte Wiseman, founder and CEO of Step Inside. Charlotte's here today to talk to us all about how we can train and develop the current generation of leaders but also the next generation of business leaders. So Charlotte, thanks for joining us today. Thought it'd be nice to hand over to you to introduce yourself and the business properly.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for welcoming me today. It's great to be here. So Step Inside is an organizational consultancy that focuses on helping to promote individual performance and organizational performance by applying neuroscience, positive psychology, and behavioral science principles, tools, techniques. So our goal really is to ensure that everybody in the workplace can think, feel, and perform at their best. So that includes leadership development, helping people to really lead well through challenging times so that they can bring out the best in people, help people play to their strengths, and helping teams to sustain that when the pressure's on. We do organizational consultancy where we really dive into helping companies address business problems with this evidence-based science background. And then we do programs around well-being, resilience, and supporting poor mental health and crisis support for those companies who are really prioritizing that area as well. So 4 arms to the business: the leadership, the consultancy, the well-being, and the mental health and crisis support.
Amazing. So it sounds actually very kind of psychologically driven then, in one sense.
Yeah, absolutely. We're very much an evidence-based company. And that is largely because when I came to this field, it's my second career, and I came to this field, I was a cynic about a lot of this stuff. I didn't, and until I'd read the science, the research, I was never a believer. And I think it is really important. There's a lot of people out there who have a lot of wonderful tools and things, but they're actually not founded on any science and they're not shown to have an impact. And we really wanted to make sure that when we were setting things up as a business, that everything had a robust evidence base where we knew the approaches we were taking were going to have the most impact for companies in that change, and those behavior changes that we're trying to encourage are going to be sustainable. So it's not just a tick box, one hit wonder. We've got people in this area, we've got people to understand things. We're actually creating long-term change. So yes, very much an evidence-based approach. We've got an amazing bank of experts. Everybody we work with has a master's or a PhD or a relevant specialist qualification in their area. And it's really, really fundamental to us.
Amazing. I guess coming to any concept as a cynic sometimes is actually how you kind of best arm yourself to defend things, isn't it? Because I think there's some big topics that you guys cover and they can be met with cynicism by business leaders sometimes, can't they? So if you can back that with data and evidence, you're always gonna win out. It seems to be the kind of the truth behind anything, whether you're talking about sales or marketing or HR, whatever in a business. If you've got evidence to back it up, people can't really argue with you as much, can they? So
no, yeah, I mean, and then definitely certain groups are more data driven than sense or purpose driven. So it's a really important one. And I must admit, when you help someone who is cynical to see a new perspective, it's one of the most fulfilling things you can have. So I quite love a resistor in a room who tells me that something doesn't exist or something doesn't work, and then being able to support them through that process of learning to consider a different perspective, understanding why, and then learning how to apply that and see the changes for themselves.
Amazing. Cool. Well, today we've come together to talk about kind of building leaders of today and of tomorrow in businesses. And I think the first place to start would be to kind of discuss around the sort of current state of leadership within organizations. And I know when we first spoke, you mentioned obviously the driving factors like pandemic and different generations changing in companies in recent years. So kind of who are the leaders of businesses today and how have they got to those positions?
Well, I think you've got a range of leaders. You've got a lot of senior leaders who are still in organizations who feel quite disconnected from the fact that they're leading different generations who are driven by different values, and have different needs. And that's proving challenging for very senior leaders with lots of experience. So there are those people. There are maybe let's call it a middle section of managers and leaders who have potentially reached that space by being expert at a skill or the delivery part of their role. And actually, there's been very little support and development for their people leadership capabilities. And given the very often remote or hybrid working practices, they've maybe had less opportunities to learn vicariously by being sat next to someone else who they could just pick up the tools from. So there's definitely a section there of the managers who are in the role trying to perform, but also feeling like I don't really have all the skills I need to do this to my full capability, but equally don't necessarily have the time to invest in the learning. So there's often this real tension at that point, knowing they need to learn, but not knowing when they're supposed to do that while they're delivering. And then you've got the aspirational leaders who are stepping into their first management roles, who are coming with a very different perspective, very often driven by very different things, and have a great visibility. But often the challenge we face there is, how do they influence up? How do they get their voices heard? And how do they act as a really powerful conduit from the people who are maybe of younger generations to communicate better with the older ones, or the more experienced ones? And I think it's complex because we are doing this in such different ways, and we are dealing with people from very different value sets coming together. So it's a very new skill set that is needed, and it is one that when people have that potential, and with all the science that we have available, there's so much that people could be doing through tiny little changes. And they often think it's got to be some magnificent change and some big change, but actually it's the micro behaviors that make all the difference to how you lead teams and how you bring out the best in yourself and how you bring out the best in others.
Interesting. I think this this kind of generational shift or development's quite an interesting thing, and it's played out in a couple of other podcast episodes actually that we've done. Where one where we were talking to Emma, who's the founder of a company called Empro, and she was talking about how they're designing office spaces, but they're now designing for a more diverse range of people than ever before, and different generations who want different things. And then we were talking about marketing strategies the other day, and how businesses need to market to people of different generations as well now. So it kind of seems to be a sort of connector that is a challenge in many different streams within a company at the moment. So it seems to be a really interesting and tough time for leaders to kind of navigate, I think, and get the best out of people, but also do the best work as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what motivates different generations is really, really interesting. And understanding and recognizing that, and actually learning to have some of the conversations where we air some of our assumptions about other generations, because I think that is often the blocker to good communication and collaboration, is this othering. Oh, that generation are this. There's some really horrible language that gets thrown around about people, but it's essentially realizing that underneath that, we all really have some very similar, very aligned values of wanting to do a good job, wanting to feel good about our work, wanting to help the company succeed so that we keep our jobs and reap the rewards of that, wanting to work in a good culture. And actually, if we can have some of the uncomfortable conversations up front about what are those preconceptions, well, actually, what are our strengths of each other, and recognizing that, then there's a huge opportunity, and it's definitely been a massive growth area of our work over the last year, has been helping companies to facilitate some of those, I'm going to call them uncomfortable conversations, but they're equally some of the most powerful conversations, is to just build that sense of understanding and connection, and really harness the full opportunity of a multi-generational workforce.
Yeah, I love that idea of uncomfortable conversations. I think that's often where you learn the most about yourself and the people you work with, isn't it? And that obviously gives you the foundations to improve. So how do you approach that in practice with businesses then? Like, what's the kind of the route of getting people from not having those conversations to having them?
Well, it's always it's different where we're depending on our starting point. You know, some companies have a very high level of psychological safety, and actually, once they're given a space, a forum, a structure to have those conversations, then actually it's relatively easy to facilitate those because you've got a foundation there at the start. So we might do with an organization like that, we might do some sessions for leaders, some more kind of conversational focus groups to understand what's going on for them. It could be a combination of some training, some focus groups, some one-to-one coaching. It can be any number of things, but you're starting with that base of psychological safety. It's one approach.
Yeah.
In other organizations, you feel that you've got a much more siloed, less safe space to start with. And therefore, before we even move to having those uncomfortable conversations, there needs to be a base level of psychological safety that's put in place. Again, we use different approaches to do that, always thinking at a leadership level, what needs to be happening, what needs to be understood, what needs to be shared. At an employee and all company level, what needs to be done differently. And then also in terms of how the company is organized and the policies, the processes, the systems, the rituals, what needs to happen to create safety there. And then you can really dive into having those uncomfortable conversations. But I think the challenge that people face is it takes a huge amount of emotional agility have these uncomfortable conversations. And there's previously been a big focus in organizations on emotional intelligence, which is now actually quite an outdated principle. And the move on, the evolution of that is emotional agility. And emotional intelligence, while it was and it still is, it's a fantastic model, it's a great model, it was often misinterpreted. And I think that is that interpretation that's caused the challenge, where people think, I've got to make everybody happy all the time, I've got to make everyone feel really comfortable all the time. But as you said, you don't learn so much from comfort. You don't grow from staying in your comfort zone. And we can't always make things sweet and happy and light because times are tough, difficult stuff happens. And therefore, we need to get used to sitting with discomfort, being okay with a little bit of less than ideal. And it's that emotional agility for people to sit with that for themselves and stay focused, clear thinking, and collaborative rather than defensive. How do people deal with that themselves? And then how do they deal with the fact that for leaders, sometimes they are going to have to make people less than happy, and that's part of their role? And how do we maintain a sense of composure through those difficult things and not feel burnt out from that emotional exhaustion? Because it is a real key contributor to leadership burnout, is the burden of the emotions that start to be at play in difficult times.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I like that angle of emotional intelligence to emotional agility because, like you say, the nature of those uncomfortable conversations, it would be very easy to have that with somebody and make them become defensive or kind of upset even at times. So having that agility to recognize when that's happening and change your approach is obviously going to be quite a key skill for people. It's really interesting as well hearing you talk there. It reminds me of there's a book I've been kind of reading on and off for a while now, called Five Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni, and it was recommended to me by our head of training here. And some of the two of the interesting concepts that I kind of took away from that is like the kind of fear or absence of trust and fear of conflict within a team. And when you're talking about the kind of creating that psychological safety in the environments for people, and also kind of like having that emotional agility to give them the trust so that they know it's not going to be a conflict or it's not coming from a bad place. It's how you're creating a team and an environment where everybody is on the same page and understands that it might be uncomfortable, but the end goal is something positive at the end of it.
Yeah. And I think the research around trust is always so fascinating because it consistently shows that if you trust people and you demonstrate trust in others, they are more likely to act in trustworthy ways. So you have to be the one to maybe put your neck out first and say, I'm going to take this risk. But actually, you're giving the best opportunity to people. And until you give someone that opportunity, you're never going to be able to see their full potential. So I think for companies who potentially are listening to this and they're thinking about psychological safety, they need to be thinking about something beyond just making people feel included, which is very often the focus. People say, oh, well, our teams can say to their managers if they're struggling. And it's like, well, that's the base level of psychological safety. Actually, we talk about psychological safety on 4 levels. And this is from a researcher called Timothy Clark. And inclusion safety is the foundation. We then move up when you have a little bit more trust, a little bit more respect, to the level of learner safety, where people are free to have a go at things, ask questions, step outside of their comfort zone. And it requires a slightly different skill set. It requires a higher level of trust. And it requires people to know that if they fail, that's okay. It's a way they learn. And that obviously has to be done within structures. You don't want to encourage people to fail too much if they're in roles where precision is essential. But you need to create the spaces elsewhere for them to have that learning capability. And then the next layer, the third layer, is contributor safety. And that's where you get up to the level of, are people free to share new ideas, maybe even if they're not asked for new ideas, just to look around them and say, what could we be doing differently? And are there platforms, are there processes, are leaders encouraging that? Do people feel able to do that? And how do we facilitate that? So new ideas are constantly coming to the surface, and companies are always saying, what more can we do? And then the peak, the absolute pinnacle of psychological safety is when we hit challenger safety. And that's that people can look around and call out mistakes, call out things which they feel are unethical or inappropriate, and do that safely. And equally say, well, we might be doing this, but I think that's not the right way. And to have that encourage that conversation. And there's so many things that managers do or don't do, depending on how good they are at this. But there's so many ways to just encourage that in every conversation you have, of saying, I don't know it all. What am I missing? Please tell me more. Just inviting that environment where challenge is seen as a good thing. And I think that's really crucial. And that supports that healthy conflict idea that you've referred to there.
Yeah, it's really, I've not heard those kind of 4 levels before. It's really interesting. Where, as you're saying that, to think about different environments that I've worked in where I'm like, oh, I think we've got kind of to level 2 of that or level 3 of that, but not quite the 4th level. So I guess that's a journey as well for businesses as well, right, and leaders to kind of build that culture. And you might get to one stage and then the next, and find different blockers on the way, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think different working environments require different things at different times. I think a lot of the challenges that I speak to companies who have maybe started as a family business or as a small startup, which has got a very friendly environment of everyone's best friends, everyone knows each other, maybe team of up to 50 or 60 people. And then suddenly there's a growth when there's an investment or a big change or the company just evolves. And actually, if you've got quite I'm going to say inclusive, friendly atmosphere, sometimes actually reaching those higher levels of psychological safety is difficult because people care about their friendships so much that they forget the professional commitments that they have to make. And coming back to that idea of developing the future of leaders, supporting leaders to step from being a colleague to being a manager when they're going through that process of growth is a really it's a difficult thing for people to deal with. That person who I was laughing with, now I have to do a performance review with them. How does that feel? So I think getting that right balance of friendly inclusion and that sense, but also encouraging that it's okay to disagree as well, is always easy for companies. It's not always easy for people.
You kind of almost link back to one of the things that you mentioned earlier, which I thought was really interesting, was kind of how there's a skills gap for leader, or different skills gaps for leaders at different levels. And one of them there that you mentioned there is like that move from colleague to manager has a requirement of a change in behavior maybe, or a change in things you do. How would you kind of like look at those skills gaps at the minute? I guess you've got those kind of, like, as you said, senior leaders, sort of middle management, and the aspirational leaders. Is there a lot of difference, do you think, where in terms of the skills gap, or are there similar sort of strands that follow through them?
I think it's interesting because I think emotional agility is one that covers all of them. Absolutely. There's definitely different requirements within each and different strengths and skills. But I think emotional agility is always something that we see. I think there's other ones that we see across all areas, things like actually having just positive routines that support people to think and feel and be at their best. I think there are sometimes themes, there's sometimes variations. I think how people learn and what those gaps look like definitely does vary across different groups. People who have been in the organization or in the industry for longer might have much more robust working patterns of how they can think at their best and then make sure they're leaving time to have deep thinking time. They might be better at setting boundaries than younger generations who are just getting used to that. But I think there's definitely different skills, there's different approaches that people prefer at different levels. But equally, everybody's an individual at the end of the day. And you certainly get people at all levels who have got to that point, and actually some fundamental behaviors, habits, skills, knowledge has never been there. And then you get some new people who are into the organization, but actually they've picked up some great ideas, some great practices from day one. So it's always subtly different, but there's themes.
Yeah, I suppose there's something in, it almost feels like the wrong word to say, but like an audit of your sort of skill set in a way, isn't it? To kind of understand where are the gaps and where are the areas for development with everybody, regardless of generation or how new you are to a business or how experienced you might be. Like, everyone's going to have something they can improve on, right?
Yeah, and I think when we're running leadership programs or we're working with companies to help them design their approach to leadership development, we're always saying, okay, what are the models? What are the underpinning models? And then you might use the same model, but think about applying it differently and in different ways at different levels based on the conversations that person would be having. So a line manager might be able to use a model in one way through one-to-one meetings, through project management. The same model might be more useful to a C-suite executive in terms of how they're structuring their decision-making process. But you're thinking about the same model, but it's going to be applied differently. And when you're facilitating any kind of program, whether that be focus groups, training, coaching programs, anything, you have to be thinking at those different levels, because different challenges will be coming up for each of those different levels. Different opportunities are there. And so you do need to think about that in terms of how the conversations are going to be had and what's going to be useful. And sometimes it's good to have a mix of different levels. Sometimes it's good to support people or understand just as sections of the business.
Excellent. And I think this may almost seem a conceited question in a way, but do you think that leadership can be trained then as such, or do you think it's a raw skill that people just have?
No, I am 100% have seen, so I know leadership can be developed. I think a fundamental thing is that some people think they want to be leaders and perhaps don't really know what leadership is or what leadership means to them. And therefore, they can throw the idea of leadership out before they give it a chance. I mean, we run leadership residentials, and very early on, one of the bits of feedback was that someone came in and they said, I've been sent by my company to be here on this leadership program. I'm not really sure this is right for me. Like, I think I want to be a leader, but being a leader doesn't feel right. And they walked away at the end of the session, and the 4 days together. It's a 4-day program. And they said, I finally realized that I can be me and be a leader. And by being me and being human and bringing all of myself to my leadership, I can be a better leader. And they were suddenly excited about the opportunity of being a leader. They understood how it aligned with their personal values as well as the organizational values. And the feedback subsequently has been that they've continued to thrive. They've had further progression within the business. Their team's one of the highest performing teams in the organization. So helping people to understand what leadership means to them, and really to analyze, is this right for me, or do I want to be a contributor or not? And more often than not, when people see the opportunity that leadership has to help them, to give them a sense of fulfillment, actually people want to step into that role. Not always, but it is about more than saying, right, we see potential in you. We're going to put you on this training program and we expect you to be a leader overnight, following our criteria, doing these things. You're rarely going to get behavior change if people are just being given skills and don't understand why it matters to them personally. And I think that's something we really invest a lot of energy and time thinking about for companies when they're designing their own programs, because having skills is very different to actually doing things. And the shift from knowledge to doing is about helping people tap into that inner motivation to do things, that this is not just because they've got to, this is because they want to do it. And it's so fundamental to everything we do.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. Actually, never really thought before about, people being put on a leadership program, but by their business without them really thinking about why or if they wanted to be a leader firstly. Although I guess what way around does that come? If you want to be a leader or why you want to be a leader? I guess you could think about that almost in a sort of cyclic kind of way, couldn't you? That you might not know you want to be a leader, but you might have something you want to achieve, and leadership is the way that gets you to that outcome potentially.
Yeah, I think it is. It's sort of not two separate questions. It's all rolled into one, as it's what does leadership mean to you? What if you were going to do it your way, what would that be? And does that fire you up? Is that the next step for you? And actually, a lot of companies are saying at the moment that they're having to be really selective with who they put through leadership development programs. And it's quite hard to sometimes communicate to people that just because you've gone through a program doesn't mean you're necessarily going to get that next promotion. This is the foundation. You have to put it into practice. So, but I absolutely, I guess coming back to the 100, everybody I believe can learn to be a leader and can evolve their own leadership to have the impact they need in the organization to meet the organization's expectations, and also to do it in a way that works for them. Not perfectly. You're never going to have it exactly as you'd like, but there's always a crossover, and it's helping people to find that balance that's really powerful.
Excellent. And you mentioned there about you guys do some of the kind of residential sort of training sessions. I'm interested to find out a bit more about kind of what sort of training is available to leaders, or how you advise they go about getting that training and development.
Yeah, it's when we're designing programs for companies, because that is really what we do. We recognize that every organization is different. What their needs are very different. So we'll usually help organizations to design their own process. And I think there's been a lot of a big shift over the last few years because of the pandemic to online learning. But for so many people, it really, people just don't engage with it so well. They find it really hard to focus. They're multitasking. And so there is a big shift happening now that companies are starting to say, actually, let's do in-person training. Let's do in-person coaching. Maybe more coaching continues still online, but very much for like, actually, let's get people in the room. Let's have conversations. Let's really explore this. And companies and individuals are seeing that the benefit of that, rather than quick fire, short webinars, 30 minutes, great, I've got a top tip, but is that really going to fundamentally change my leadership? Maybe we have to consider what else needs to happen in the background to make sure that if it's an online learning program, it does create change. And there are ways of doing that. You can do webinars mixed with group coaching, mixed with nudges and micro behaviors and extra learning. But it takes a process more than we'll do a webinar and we'll expect everyone to totally change. The immersive programs, whether that be a 1 or 2 day program in someone's office, or at a residential space, at a hotel, at a conference center, that's where we've seen a lot of companies starting to shift. Our flagship program that we run as an open course is a 4-day one, and we run that at a private residence. So it's not a hotel, it's a private property. And that way people can really invest the time in stepping out of their normal thinking patterns, to think differently, to consider new perspectives, to learn from colleagues from other organizations who are going through similar but different challenges, share best practices. And it's a balance of workshops, activities. Supported reflection time is really crucial as well. So we have a lot of models to promote behavior change, and we will help people to use those so they take away the learning and actually can put it into action, rather than just walking away with lots of knowledge and nothing, no action plan. And then we run those programs, those same immersive residentials for organizations. Again, flexing it a little bit. Sometimes an organization will be comfortable with a 5-day, which is great. Sometimes they say, oh, we need to squeeze it into a 2 or a 3-day, and we have to pick out what we do and we don't do. But the in-person learning seems to be taking a little bit of a coming back onto the map, let's say.
I guess that's sort of happening in a lot of strands around work at the moment, of kind of pushing to more in-person than Zooms or Teams calls all the time. So, but I always think it's good. I think you learn a lot in person, I think, don't you? Sometimes, like the interaction. And I find that really interesting about the residentials. You've got people from different businesses as well. So it's kind of different challenges, different perspectives, that are completely different to what people might experience in their day-to-day business.
Yeah, and we do see I think people are often surprised by how much value they get out of that. They like the idea, but they say, "Oh, but you won't understand." You know, one of the wasn't the first one, but one of the early programs we ever ran, we had someone from hospitality, someone from who ran their own business, someone was a consultancy firm, a couple of engineers, and everyone was sort of sitting there going, "Oh, you're dealing with that as well." And they thought that everybody else was going through these totally different challenges, but actually some of the core challenges were the same. What worked in some organizations, people were saying, well, that just won't work for mine because I've got X number of remote workers who are on site and that doesn't work. But very often the ideas and the kind of cross collaboration of ideas, and that really is where there's such a fertile ground for new ideas and thinking about things. And then after the program, we do supported coaching so that people stay in touch. And actually, I heard from a couple of people the other day who met on one of our residentials that they met at a conference in Italy intentionally. They both knew they were going to be the same conference in Italy, so they stayed in touch and said, "Oh, should we grab a drink while we're out in Italy?" And so that's great. They've built connections for life where they can continue to be someone who maybe is a safe person to discuss challenges because they're a little bit more removed and they have a bit more perspective or a different perspective.
Yeah, I guess that's a really interesting kind of added angle of like sort of building your network a little bit, isn't it? Kind of finding those, again, might be contacts that are in a completely different world to you, but like you say, there is often a lot of crossover. And I think a lot of leadership challenges can also kind of come back to people and kind of how you're managing people, managing your team and motivating them. And everyone kind of shares that challenge, I guess, regardless of whether you're hospitality or engineering, you're still working with people every day, and that's probably going to be your main driver day to day in what you're doing. So you're always going to learn like that.
Yeah. And I think right now everybody's facing the challenge of leaders are being expected to do more with less. They've got very often, well, everybody seems to feel they've got less time. Very often there's less budget available. For some companies, there's also less headcount. And it's do more with less in a changeable and totally uncertain environment. You know, so I guess, again, number of organizations I've been helping through processes of change, whether that's transition in leadership, whether it's transition in working practices, whether it's transition back to the workplace. So much of a conversation right now is how do we lead people through change so that they can sustain high performance through that, stay motivated, stay engaged, stay positive, stay capable. And then after a change, not just assuming like, well, the change has happened, everyone just carry on. Actually, there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done to make sure that after a change, organizations help people to really connect with the new organization and the new values and the new vision and whatever is happening, and to make sure that we sustain the impact and the positive impact and accelerate that impact. And so we've been a lot of work with companies doing that sort of process from preparing for change, supporting and sustaining performance through change, and then accelerating and sustaining the impact of change. And that is every organization seems to be going through some change at the moment. And I was at a conference the other day and someone said, change is now like the new oxygen. We just have that it's always happening. You know, it's not like, oh, we've got a change initiative. It's like change is just here. That's life.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it's an interesting thing for people as well, because some people like change and some people don't like change. So it's depending on which category you feel in, you're probably more or less comfortable with that, aren't you? So
We often find that with change, it's fine if we feel we have some sense of influence or control. It's when it's totally imposed upon us that change usually feels uncomfortable for people. And so helping people feel that they're just part of that conversation, that their voices are being heard, that their feelings are being acknowledged and recognized even by doing that, even saying it's okay to find this uncomfortable, it's okay if you don't love this, that makes already people feel more engaged in that process. It's when it's ignored and people are expected to just continue, that's usually where the problem starts to evolve. But if people have the opportunity to have their voices heard, to feel like they're part of that change, like they're coming on that journey, and it's for them and they're with that, it usually is a really simple way to harness a bit more of the upside of the pressure and the discomfort that people feel.
There's lots of interesting strands to pick at here. One that I thought was quite interesting that you mentioned was the kind of people saying in businesses they don't have time for things, and we're speaking about people's skills gap as well, and people say, you know, seeing time as a challenge to training and development. So how do you kind of advise business leaders and leaders in general go about kind of self-development and prioritizing that?
It's really almost just as simple as you've said there, in that it's just about realizing the value of it, realizing the value, recognizing that we can't learn everything all at once, I think is really, really crucial. So not expecting that you can read one book, implement it, and it's all happened. That learning is a process of slow integration into the memory systems and the habit systems. I'd say is the simplest way to think of it, is that you kind of need to drip feed. You can read a foundation, but you need to practice, you need to reiterate, you need to continue to reflect. And whether it is that you are investing in going to a conference or reading a book or attending a training program, you have to make sure that you're going back to that learning on a regular basis and you're building in reflection time. So there's a huge benefit to just building in reflection time every single day to your day, stronger pieces once a week, or every couple of weeks, but building in rituals to support development. So for most leaders, what I would always encourage is 10 to 15 minutes first thing in the day, before you've opened a phone or checked a message or checked an email. And that's fundamental. You need to sort of tap into your memory systems when they're at the most receptive. And taking 10, 15 minutes first thing in the day to really say, okay, you know, maybe what have I learned? What are my priorities today? To reflect, and to think about development on that micro action every day is really powerful. And then thinking about on sprints of whether you do that as a weekly basis or a 2-weekly basis, saying, okay, what have been the things that have supported the success, the things that have gone well in this period of time? What can I learn from that? How can I replicate that? How can I do that more? And then similarly, if I were going to do it again, what would I do differently? What didn't go as well as I'd hoped? What could I have done differently, or what could I do differently next time? But making sure that we're taking time to analyze our experiences, focusing on what we're doing well as not doing well, because most people will just focus on what they're not doing well. Really, really powerful. Any little bit of micro learning you can do, great, but equally knowing the value of investing a few days. Like I say, you know, we find that the sweet spot is that 4-day, because people feel they can get away for that amount of time. But investing that in yourself, because it is going to save you time, it is going to save you energy, it is going to improve performance for others, and it isn't going to improve your own personal performance, well-being, and fulfillment. And just knowing that it's not going to be something that's going to happen without you investing in yourself. You know, it's like, if you don't buy the lottery ticket, you're never going to win the lottery. Well, it's quite simple. Buy the lottery ticket.
That's good advice. We should all buy lottery tickets now. But no, there's lots and lots of really interesting things there, and we've covered lots of different areas. I'm sure we could also delve into a lot more as well. But the final thing I kind of wanted to ask you today is, as you know, we wrap up our podcast episodes now by asking all of our guests to recommend a book for our On the Up book club. So we'd love to get your take on what is a good book for people to read.
I've chosen a book for this that is, it's not a very new, it's not, it's not the latest book out, but I still love it. And it's the book that opened my mind to the power of what creating a good culture really could do in terms of how it could help performance. And it was the book that changed my perception of what I could just be doing as a manager, as a leader. And the book was The Happiness Advantage by Sean Aker. And it's one of his very early books. I still think it's fantastic. I was a cynic when I came to this book, and even the title I didn't love, coupled with the fact that my brother had recommended it, which meant, I was like, oh, my older brother's telling me what to do again. And I read it and I thought, that's pretty good. And there's some pretty compelling evidence. Now, the evidence now, because the book is not the most up to date, it's all evolved. There are newer editions of it. But I think it's a really nice, easy read, quick dip in to what the power of positive psychology in the workplace could be. And there's so much of me that wants to offer a second book, but I don't think you're going to allow me that, are you?
Well, you are very welcome if you would like to recommend a second book.
So the second one is a newer one, and that was by Cal Newport, and that's called Slow Productivity. And that's it's an interesting book that was published last year, but it talks about the pace of work at the moment and how it's possibly not promoting optimal performance, and it's not helping us to think at our best, and it's actually not realistic. So it's also it's inhibiting performance, and it's impairing well-being and resilience. So quite an interesting book, what effective working is, and challenging questions out there, which I think would be useful for a lot of people to think about.
Amazing. They both sound great. I love a good book recommendation, and you're more than welcome to have two when they're good recommendations like that. So I'll definitely check them out, and hopefully some of our listeners will too. But it's been a great conversation today. It's been really, really interesting to speak to you. Lots and lots of different things I think that people will go and take away. So I'd just like to finish by saying thanks so much, Charlotte, for taking the time to join us today. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you for inviting me. I look forward to hearing how you get on with the books.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the On the Up podcast, brought to you from Moneypenny. Stay tuned for our next episode coming soon.